Good morning. The scripture reading that I've chosen for this morning comes from John chapter 3, verse 31. And it reads, "The one who comes from above is above all. The one who is of the earth belongs to the earth and speaks about earthly things. The one who comes from heaven is above all." Before I begin, I did want to thank my wife, Peggy, who's here with us, my children, Sam and Vicky, who are both in college and hopefully up by now, and my friends, Paul and Laura, Don Burton, and Cecily Stranahan, who's here, for listening to me yammer on over the years, and more recently, Allie and Julie. I don't claim to have any particularly unique insight other than the ability to surround myself with people like you, so thank you. Now, I've called this truth in the resurrection very deliberately. I did not call it the truth of the resurrection. And the reason for that is that while I'll start with a view on the truth of the resurrection, I'll end in a different place. And where I'll end is that there is so much more we can learn about the notion of truth from the resurrection than that a human body came alive after having been dead. So in order to do this, we'll have to contemplate what is truth. And is there a difference between truth and reality? And if so, what's their relationship? And what is science, our common sense, and our Christian faith tell us about where to find truth and how to think about reality? I'm going to begin with a very basic proposition that the fundamentals of accurate Christian doctrine through Jesus' way and teaching is intensely appealing in the depths of the human spirit and emotions. This isn't a novel concept. The great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung theorized that there's a religious instinct in all humans, or perhaps better said, using today's nomenclature, there's a spiritual instinct in humankind. There's a reason that Christianity has been around for 2,000 years, notwithstanding our inability to get our heads around the gospel accounts of the resurrection and the miracles. And there's a reason it rose up and took hold in humanity against all odds under the Roman Empire, and that Jesus' disciples and apostles died horrific deaths defending it. And there's a reason that Buddhism was around for hundreds of years before that, and that Judaism was around for more than 1,000 years before that. Now, I've often asked myself, as appealing as Christianity is as a moral framework, how much of the historical accounts in the gospel do we need to accept or believe as Christians? As Christians, is it sufficient to merely believe in the ultimate goodness of Jesus, or do we need to agree that Jesus' resurrection and miracles in fact happened? And if we aren't ready to accept the accuracy of the gospel, what does that mean for our Christian faith? Is this a binary question? That is to say, are we either resurrection-believing Christians or we're not Christians at all? Or is there some sort of sliding scale of Christianity where we believe in the greatness of Jesus, but we can't accept the resurrection, and therefore we're sort of moderate Christians? These are the questions that have sent me on a journey of trying to figure out whether I could intellectually support the resurrection in order to justify my deep emotional attachment to the Christian faith. Because I felt in my gut the resonance of Christian doctrine, I felt compelled to validate that feeling by the facts as set forth in the New Testament. In other words, I thought it was important for me to prove the historical accuracy of Jesus by trying to argue for the reliability of the accounts of his life in the New Testament. But as I've gone down this path, and this is a lifelong journey, I've discovered that the truth of Jesus, the truth, doesn't lie in proving the resurrection through human intellectual models and standards of historical accuracy as established by human scholars. Jesus' truth, and the truth of the resurrection for that matter, is in something far beyond that which we as imperfect humans can ever describe in words or prove through the scientific method. Yet his truth is something we can most definitely seek, understand, and live by. Now, before I get to the truth in the resurrection, I just need to take you down the first path that I traveled, which was fundamental to the process. So let me just start by explaining my mindset in trying to prove the historical accuracy of the gospel. I didn't start without a bias. I started from the proposition that the gospel must be historically accurate if the message of Jesus grew to be as powerful and as compelling as it is. That is, unless the resurrection actually occurred, the events that followed Jesus' death would not have happened. Now, of course, there are alternative explanations for the rise of Christianity, but I didn't find them as compelling. I developed the view that if Jesus gave rise to what has probably been the most powerful human movement in the history of humankind, and if my inexplicable emotional affection could be intellectually reasoned through an argument that there is objective accuracy to the historical Jesus and what followed his life and death, then there must also be a unique theological validity to Jesus. And if based on the theological validity, one accepts that Jesus is the perfect incarnation of man, it must be that commitment to his way of life is crucially important to the conscious person. I even came to the view that as a Christian, I was obligated always to be ready to defend my faith. I found New Testament guidance from Paul where he wrote in his letter to the Colossians, "Conduct yourself wisely toward outsiders, making the most of your time. Let your speech always be gracious, as though seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone." And in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, "We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ." In one translation of that, it's not we destroy arguments, it's we demolish arguments. Now that sounded a little aggressive to me, but at that point in my journey, I kind of liked things like that. So I did it. I came up with what I thought was a really convincing argument, to me at least, that the New Testament was a historically reliable account and therefore objectively accurate, and therefore my Christian faith was justified. And in summary, the argument was based on 4 points. First, the New Testament was, in fact, a historical account based on eyewitnesses. Second, the New Testament bears the traditional hallmarks of historical accuracy. Third, reliable alternative accounts don't exist. And fourth, rejection of the historical record unfairly presumes the implausibility of the events in it. So let me just build that out a bit so you can get a sense of where I was. I'm not going to give you the entire argument, but it is fundamental to where I end up on the truth to be found in the resurrection. And the foundation of the factual accuracy is critical to understanding the concept of truth. So let me take the first point. There's a sufficiently reliable and consistent historical record by eyewitnesses of the events. We've heard this through Paul's sermons, through many of Laura's sermons. Scholars debate this. This is not an easy thing on which to come to ground. It's not in vogue in the intellectual and academic community to believe in the historical reliability of the gospel. But there is good evidence that the Gospels were written by educated Greek scribes based on what disciples and apostles and other eyewitnesses reported. The fact of the matter is, we don't know who wrote the Gospels. What we do know is that they were written within decades of Jesus' life in a form that appears to be a historical record as opposed to an apocryphal story at a time when numerous eyewitnesses to the events recorded were still alive. Now, for some, that may be enough, but let me just build out the other 3 points. The historical record bears the hallmarks of accuracy. The historical accounts of the New Testament meet the ordinary standards for acceptance of their truth by historians. There are multiple consistent accounts of the work performed by Jesus during his life, including the miracles and corroborating reliable accounts of the resurrection. The Gospels are generally thought to have been written within 40 to 65 years following Jesus' death, which is sufficiently close in time to the events to be considered reliable by most historians' standards. And there are even earlier accounts of Jesus that come from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, generally thought to have been written within 20 years of Jesus' death, recording Paul's account of Jesus' resurrection, his appearance to Peter, and then to the apostles, and then to hundreds of people at once, many of whom he said were still alive at the time that he wrote the letter. Now, one thing scholars do agree on is that Paul, who we heard in the last couple of weeks, was a Pharisee persecutor of Christians at the hands of the Roman Empire, who converted after Jesus appeared to him, that he wrote at least 7 of the 13 or 14 letters. We don't know for sure who wrote Hebrews, but that he wrote at least 7 of the 13 or 14 letters ascribed to him. And some of the source material on which the Gospels, according to Matthew and Luke, were written came from pre-existing sources, like the Gospel of Mark and other earlier sources. So it's not as if the Gospels just sprung up out of nowhere decades after Jesus' death in some sort of conspiratorial effort to create a religion. Now, my third point was that reliable alternative accounts don't exist. So in the face of the reliable historical accounts, the alternative to believing in the miracles and the resurrection, I came to the view, was less likely. There, in fact, are no alternative reliable explanations recorded anywhere. There may be alternative accounts of Jesus' life, like in the Gnostic Gospels, but there is no historical account that explains or even denies that the miracles occurred, or that Jesus' body was gone from the tomb, or that the boulder was rolled away from the wrong tomb, or providing some other explanation. Now, people have provided these explanations today, but if the alternative could have been supported then, surely Roman and Jewish leaders would have promoted an alternative narrative to avoid the faith building around Jesus following his death and resurrection. But that alternative account doesn't exist. Not even Judas claimed Christ was a liar or a fraud, or that his miracles were a hoax. In other words, the criticism of the accuracy of the New Testament isn't, I believe, one historical account versus another. It's, I don't believe the New Testament account because the translations were bad or because they aren't adequately supported. Now let me get to my final point. And this is where things really took off for me and sent me beyond the truth of the resurrection to the truth in the resurrection. And that last point is that rejection of the historical record unfairly presumes the implausibility of the events in it. I came to the view that rejection of the reliable historical record presumes that miracles and a resurrection are not possible because they're not consistent with our current understanding of science and nature. Were it not for the miracles and the resurrection, there almost certainly would be far less debate on the reliability of the gospel. My observation was that the gospel is held to a different standard than other historical records because its content is so remarkable and difficult to accept, because it can't be explained with what we believe to be our current understanding of nature. That, however, can't be the reason for rejection if it's also the reason for its acceptance by us as Christians. So this is where things get interesting. Because at this point, if you ascribe to Christianity, you have some choices to make as to how you're going to treat the gospel. You could accept the factual accuracy and believe that we may not yet know what's possible and that a one-time event like a resurrection is in fact possible, notwithstanding its inconsistency with our understanding of nature, our current understanding of nature. That's one view you could take. You could take the view that Jesus was the most compelling human being ever to have lived, and his teaching was great, but the gospel is an account by uninformed people who believed in the possibility of magical things like a resurrection before humans understood science and psychology and how the human mind works, even though Jesus did not in fact rise from the dead. Or you could take the view that the resurrection is just all made up, that even the authors of the gospel knew it, but that you like what the gospel says anyway, and therefore you ascribe to the Christian faith. Is any one of those views sufficient? I concluded not. And that brings me to the difference between reality and truth. We don't usually distinguish between reality and truth. We think of them as synonymous, as do many of the ancient and modern day philosophers. But I think it's really important to distinguish between these two concepts in order to understand where you come out on the gospel and how you think about the truth of the resurrection. So let's begin with reality. Reality, I'll posit, is not what we as humans perceive through our five senses. Our perception of the external world is merely a human interpretation of matter around us. It's not objectively what actually exists in the universe. How do I know this? Well, because we know that there are entire worlds that we never perceive and that behave in ways that we don't understand. The quantum world, for example, or the world of subatomic particles, is one of those worlds. It's a world where particles can exist in more than one position at the same time, where the behavior of one particle affects the behavior of another millions of miles away, where concepts of space and time do not even exist. We take for granted that everything exists in space and time, the dimensions through which we experience our world. But we all know that Einstein showed us that circumstances exist in our universe, such as black holes where space-time doesn't exist. And Einstein proved that mass can warp space-time to generate what we understand as gravity, and that time doesn't move at a constant rate in the universe. That's hard for us to fathom because we only know a world in which space-time exists. But should that mean that we reject it? Most theoretical physicists would agree that our entire concept of space-time is not objectively real. It's a human construction. And therefore, because we are imperfect, it too must be imperfect. Now, to make this even easier and closer to home, for those of you who have a dog, you know your dog perceives a world through its nose that we never perceive. Just as an aside, we adopted a dog a year ago, and my kids wouldn't forgive me if I failed to mention Obi today. And hopefully not so close to home, although this is a judgment-free zone. We know that with psychedelic drugs or stimulating different areas of the brain, our perception of reality can be drastically altered. There is a world of activity right in front of us that we filter out so that we can pay attention to what matters to us. That's the case for all animals. There are lots of scientific experiments that show us how much we filter out from what's going on around us, either because our senses have evolved not even to be able to perceive that activity with our five senses, or because we have limited ability to process all of the information in front of us at once. That's incontrovertible. There is a lot that is hidden to us. So who's to say what reality is? Reality, that is all that exists independent of the observer, must be unknowable and imperceivable by humans because we are imperfect. Now, you could stop me right here and say, well, if we can never know reality, it's not even worth talking about, because you could posit anything as possible and I can't disprove it because you've set up the argument to preclude any counter-argument. I assure you I am not trying to end the inquiry there. At this point, you may be wishing that I would. But as I'll get to, I do believe that we have the opportunity to get close, or at least closer to reality. Reality, whatever it is where God is, whatever God is. Now, this might be a good time to look at the diagram in the bulletin illustrating this, where God and reality are infinite and in that outer circle, and of course vastly larger than the world of humanity, represented by the inner circle in the diagram, and the earthly things that we're capable of perceiving. By the way, a big thank you to Julie for helping me with that. This is an important concept, and it's all over the New Testament. In Hebrews, the author wrote, "Faith is the conviction of things not seen." Paul captured this several times, emphasizing that which is beyond human perception. To the Corinthians, he wrote, "What can be seen lasts only for a time, but what cannot be seen lasts forever." To the Colossians, he wrote, "Do not let anyone condemn you in matters of food and drink, or of observing festivals, new moons, or Sabbaths. These are only a shadow of what is to come, but the reality is found in Christ." Also to the Colossians, he wrote, "Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth." And in John's first letter, he wrote, "Do not love the world or things in the world. Everything that belongs to the world, what people see and want, and everything in this world that people are so proud of, none of this comes from God. It comes from the world." In Matthew, when Peter is protesting Jesus' prediction of his ghastly death and suffering, Jesus says to Peter, "You're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." These are all ways of saying our earthly existence is not what is of God, or in fact real or true. Reality is God, which is not accessible through our perception of the world alone. Now, to be absolutely clear, I am not saying that we should reject what we perceive through our five senses, or that we should discard science because it's from humans, and because it will never be able to show us objective reality. Our senses, in fact, are a conduit to something very important, and science should be embraced precisely because it's shown us that there is a vast, vast world that we neither understand nor perceive. Science is crucial and a gift from God. It's driven by the everlasting wonder given to conscious beings, which can be explained, in my view, by none other than a force not fully knowable by us, which is God. Science is our imperfect and bounded construct, but it's the best we have, to quote my friend Don Burton. And science and our senses give us a way of communing with one another by sharing similar experiences that come through our five senses and communicating effectively about nature and the universe around us. The renowned Richard Dawkins, one of the four horsemen of the new atheist movement, has said, "I'm against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world." I believe he has it wrong. It is quite the opposite. Religious pursuit, and better yet, religious understanding, forces us to ask and reconcile these historical accounts of Jesus in a world in which our scientific models of nature have not yet been able to explain it. There's no complacency about it. We're not satisfied with not understanding the world. We accept that there are things that are beyond imperfect humans. And if we're doing our jobs, we're on an endless journey to bring meaning to them. Our understanding of Jesus, of course, by definition, will always be limited by the limitations of humanity, which is finite, as represented in the inner circle in the diagram. But that doesn't mean that there is not a very important truth to Jesus and the resurrection. So this is where I turn to truth, which I distinguish from reality. While we cannot know reality, as Christians, we can know what is true. This concept has its roots in the ancient Greek philosophers. Plato and Socrates believed that the physical world is not real or true, as timeless, absolute, unchangeable ideas, or what Plato called the forms. The forms were the ideal of anything: a perfect circle, a perfect tree, perfect beauty. While we have imperfect versions of these on earth, forms were transcendent to our own world, the physical world or the world perceived through our senses. And they were also the essential basis of reality. True knowledge, to Plato, was the ability to grasp the forms with one's mind, which could not be gained by perceiving through our five senses. Now, Plato famously illustrated this in the allegory of the cave, where he hypothesized a group of prisoners chained in a cave since birth, such that all they can observe with their eyes is the shadows on the cave wall, projected from people and things in the sun behind them. They associate the sounds with the shadows, but the shadows are only a representation of reality. They're not reality itself. It's only when the prisoner is freed from the cave that the prisoner can get closer to reality. But when the prisoner is freed, the light hurts his eyes, and he turns back to the familiar and retreats to the cave where what he sees is clearer than what's shown to him on the outside. It's hard to turn from the familiar, to open our consciousness to something that shakes what we thought we understood about the world. The prisoner's a great illustration of how we live in that inner circle in the diagram. We are the prisoners. And this comes from the New Testament also. How many times does Jesus say that he's telling the truth, or truly I tell you, or in the Gospel according to John, very truly I tell you? He invokes that word or expression dozens of times when he's preaching, as does St. Paul, by the way, in his letters. Now, the casual listener takes that to mean that Jesus is saying, I'm not lying to you. But he means something far more significant. Jesus doesn't have to say, I'm not lying. That's a given. What he means is that he's communicating that which matters. That which will bring humankind closer to God. That which binds God's creation together. That which will ultimately resonate in your soul. You see, the English word truth doesn't exactly capture the meaning of the Greek word in the New Testament, which is aletheia. Aletheia is a concept best described as the uncovering of what is hidden. In John, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Also in John, when Jesus says to Pontius Pilate, I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth, Pilate, who is being portrayed as without any moral substance, asks, what is truth? This is Pilate discarding what is the single most important concept in the New Testament, which is truth. When preaching in the temple to a resistant crowd, John reports that Jesus tells them that if they follow his teaching, they will know the truth, and the truth will set them free. In other words, if you set your goal on that which is hidden, that which is not experienced through the five senses, you will be liberated from the burden of pursuing earthly things. Truth isn't perceivable through the five senses. It's hidden. But as Christians, truth is what we can know. There are universal truths that are hidden to the five senses, but that exist regardless of context and don't evolve over time. They aren't abstract observations in human consciousness. They're things that we as humanity universally strive to achieve. Love, gratification, sense of purpose. Truths are empathy, ethics, compassion, love, beauty, forgiveness, and reason. And there are many others. There are things that aren't dependent on human construction or language or scientific knowledge. They exist independent of the labels and explanations we give them. We all know they exist, but we can't explain them in words or by scientific methodology. They can't be reduced to a physicalist explanation. They're elusive. They're hidden. And because they're universally experienced and so elusive, we desperately try to box them in with human descriptions or by trying to explain them as functions of hormones or neural impulses. But we all know that these truths can't be reduced to that. They're more than that. They're universally experienced and understood, not in the head, but in the heart. Not in the body, but in the mind. Not in the brain, but in our consciousness. They're the things that we live for. Again, I'm not suggesting that our senses are irrelevant to seeking and understanding the truth. Just as I said earlier that we shouldn't ignore our senses because they won't lead us to reality, I'll make the same point that our senses can be a path to truth. In many ways, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. For example, we can look at a painting by Da Vinci. We can taste a Chateau Margaux. We can listen to Mozart's Requiem. But if all we're doing is seeing and tasting and listening without experiencing the truth of beauty in each of those experiences, we're only observing color on a canvas, or tasting fermented grape juice in a glass, or hearing a series of notes. We're not understanding and experiencing the universal truth of beauty, which is derived from each of those experiences and can and should be life-altering. Let me give you another example. I can give my money away so that I can be recognized as a donor in the charity bulletin, or so that I can go to the gala. But I'm not experiencing the universal truth of charity. Jesus warns in Matthew chapter 6, "Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for you then have no reward from your Father in heaven." He's not saying God will punish us. He means you're missing out. You're missing the experience of truth in charity. Similarly, I can look at my wife. I can smell her hair. I can touch her skin. But if I'm merely seeing and smelling and touching, I'm perceiving only that which is in our world, the inner circle in the diagram. I'm not experiencing the universal truths of love and beauty. One online definition of truth, which comes from somebody named John MacArthur. I have no idea whether this guy has any authority whatsoever, but I liked his definition, and it's in the bulletin, and it reads, "Truth is that which is consistent with the mind, will, character, glory, and being of God. Even more to the point, truth is the self-expression of God." Truth, I believe, is the closest we can get as humans to reality. That is God. Truth is represented by the arrows in the schematic, which come from God and present themselves in our confined world. I made Julie revise that diagram to make sure that the arrows were actually penetrating that inner circle, to show that they, in fact, present themselves to humanity. Truth is a gift God has given us through Jesus, who personified truth on earth. And that is the purpose of the Christian faith, to know and live in truth. I don't mean being honest in the sense of the English word, although that may be part of it. I mean truth by the Greek definition, uncovering that which is hidden and not perceivable through our five senses. That is, living in recognition of the only things that are universal and persist across time and space, that have existed forever, across culture, age, geography, and history. Seeking understanding and living by the truth, as lived by Jesus, I have come to the view, is vastly more important to the Christian faith than intellectually arguing the foundational point, which is the historical accuracy of the resurrection. You see, I spent a lot of time trying to fit Jesus into a construct of human intellectual historical accuracy, but I missed the more important point, and that is that the resurrection was true, not that I could box it into a human intellectual framework. What I was trying to do was to limit the resurrection by explaining the resurrection when what I needed to do was to recognize the truth in the resurrection. That is, the universal, timeless power of selfless love and sacrifice and suffering. Now, suffering is a truth too, but that's for a whole nother sermon. I was presuming through my own ego and a desire to crush any competing view that the resurrection in fact occurred, to use a human explanation to justify my faith. But as soon as we try to explain truth in human terms, we're presuming that the resurrection is of man and therefore limiting its significance. There is so much more to the resurrection than that we be able to state with compelling conviction that Jesus was dead and then he was alive again and he walked the earth for 40 days before ascending into heaven. In the Cloud of Unknowing, which is an anonymous Christian text on contemplative prayer from the 14th century, the author writes, thinking mind functions by means of concepts, images, words, and so on. But God is beyond the grasp of concepts. No word can capture God. God can well be loved, but God cannot be thought. God is eternal. The human mind is finite. If God could be comprehended, surrounded by a concept, this would make us greater than God. We invent the illusion that God is a thing that we lack and must therefore seek, find, and attempt to control. The truth of the resurrection was that Jesus enabled us to see that there is more than our physical laws and our limited human senses can perceive. And that if we can see that our purpose is to seek, understand, and live by the truth, we will live in God's grace. Jesus talks a lot about the hypocrisy in obeying the law but behaving badly. It's not enough, Jesus tells us, to follow the man-made construct of the law if we're not living by the truth of love, charity, and justice. St. Paul writes about the distinction between the law and the Spirit. In his letter to the Romans, he repeatedly says that obedience to the law, while necessary, is not a path to God. Jesus made us see something no one has ever been able to make us see. He uncovered what was hidden to the senses, in the truest sense of the Greek concept of aletheia. And that is the truth in the resurrection. The fact of the matter is that human eyes, human perception was so transformed to what we thought was reality, like the prisoner in Plato's allegory of the cave, whose entire perception of reality was shaken when he was taken to see the sun. Those who chose to follow Jesus experienced what had been previously hidden to them, either because they were fixated on only following the law or on earthly things. It's not like we were walking around 2,000 years ago believing that people could return from the dead. People didn't think resurrection was possible. We understood death. That wasn't something that was in the realm of what we thought could happen. So what does this mean as a practical matter in our daily lives? Well, to me, someone who lives in a world where intellectual prowess reigns, where we derive our self-worth from whether we beat or outwit our opponents or even our colleagues, where matters of the heart are subordinate to matters of the mind, where money and power are the motivators for all action, it means that we need to recognize that these are not truth. These are not the truths that Jesus wants us to seek, understand, and live by. They may be features of our daily lives in the same way that the color of the sky is and the sounds on the street are, but they're not the metrics by which we as Christians have been taught to measure our self-worth, our worth to humankind, or the degree of meaning in our lives. No, what is right in front of us, pushing and pulling every action, isn't always what is true. I'm not going to be able to wrap this up neatly. I haven't finished the journey. I hope I never will. All I can say is that I've begun discovering a world that allows me to contemplate the most important features of human existence in the form of truths, personified in Jesus in a way incomparable to any other. And that, I have come to believe, is the purpose of the Christian faith. Amen.